Okay, so we talked about facilitated diffusion, which is the movement of molecules along the concentration gradient. They need a little bit of help, but in general, they don't require any input of energy. So section 5.4 is about active transport, which does require energy because the solutes are moving against the concentration gradient. So facilitated diffusion is kind of a way to speed up the transport of molecules, but they're once again still moving from high to low concentration. But there are some transport proteins that can move solutes against their concentration gradient. So from low concentration to high concentration. And going back to the Disneyland example, that would be like if you were at California Adventure when Disneyland was really crowded and you're now trying to get into Disneyland and you have to push your way through all those people, it's going to take a lot of energy. The same is true for active transport. So because active transport is moving substances against their concentration gradient, once again from low concentration, low amount to high amount, it requires energy, and usually this is in the form of ATP, which we haven't quite gotten to study yet in great depth, but next unit it will be coming. But ATP is basically the form of cellular energy that is used for a lot of things, and active transport is one of them. So the main purpose of active transport is to help cells maintain a concentration gradient that differ from their surroundings. And a lot of times active transport deals with ions, so charged molecules moving back and forth. And one example of this is the sodium-potassium pump. So this is kind of a picture of the cell membrane system, and you can see there are lots of sodium ions outside the cell and not as many potassium ions. And then inside the cell, there is a lot of potassium but not a lot of sodium, and this is going to influence how these molecules move across the membrane. So basically what happens is if inside the cell, like I said, there's low sodium and high sodium outside the cell. And the potassium is high inside the cell and low outside the cell. So the sodium is going to bind to the sodium-potassium pump, which is just this transport protein right here. And when the protein is in this shape, it's trying to get sodium to bind. So you can see it's low here and high here. So it's open because it wants the sodium to bind. When that sodium binds, something called phosphorylation happens. And this is basically where a phosphate is removed from ATP. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. When we remove a phosphate group, we get adenosine diphosphate with two phosphate groups, and that releases energy. That energy allows the protein to change shape, which reduces its affinity for the sodium ions. So you can see now they're not going to fit there, and so they've been now released outside the cell. As the sodium ion concentration outside the cell builds back up, the protein now has an affinity for the shape of the potassium ions. And so those potassium ions are going to bind onto the protein, and that's going to release a phosphate group from the protein. The loss of that phosphate group brings the shape back to its original state, which you can see has a high affinity for sodium, but a low affinity for potassium. And so the potassium gets released back into the cell, and the affinity for sodium is high again, and the cycle repeats. But as you can see here, the sodium is moving from in to out, low to high, and the potassium is moving from out to in, low to high. So it has to have that ATP energy in order to move against its concentration gradient. So this is kind of a summary of the different types of transport. Regular diffusion is movement along the concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. No extra help or energy is required. Facilitated diffusion is the movement of molecules, once again, along the concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. But once again, they don't require any extra energy. This can happen through a channel protein, which opens and closes to let molecules through, or it can happen through a carrier protein, like this. And then finally, active transport is the movement of molecules from low concentration to high concentration. And most of the time, proteins are still required and ATP energy is required because they're moving against their concentration gradient. So in this case, the circular molecules, probably the sodium, are moving from low to high, and the square molecules, what could be the potassium, are moving from low to high, just in opposite directions. And that one requires energy and uses a protein. The membrane potential is a voltage across the cell membrane, which is caused by differences in the distribution of positive and negative ions across a membrane. So basically, how much sodium and potassium are on either side because of their charges determine the membrane potential. And based on the membrane potential, you're going to see there's a difference in the movement of molecules across the membrane. The change in membrane potential is kind of the signal for these molecules to move. So two combined forces, which we call the electrochemical gradient, drive the diffusion of ions across the membrane. It's called electrochemical because there's a chemical force, which is the ion's concentration gradient, and then the electrical force, which is the membrane's potential's effect on the movement of those ions. This results in kind of a pump of ions across the membrane known as an electrogenic pump. And this is basically a transport protein that generates a voltage across a membrane. And it can generate that voltage because it's moving ions back and forth. In animal cells, the sodium-potassium pump is the major electrogenic pump of the animal cells. That's the most famous one, and that's the one you'll hear about the most. But in plants, fungi, and bacteria, they also have an ion pump, which is known as the proton pump. And the reason why these are so important is because they can help store energy that can be used for cellular work. With the membrane potential changing, it builds up a lot of energy, and then we can send an action potential to help that sodium-potassium pump work properly. So here's an example of the proton pump. You can see once again there's a protein. We're moving hydrogen ions, H+, which are also known as protons, that's why it's called the proton pump, from low to high concentration, and we need that ATP. Co-transport occurs when there is the active transport of one solute that drives the transport of other solutes. And plant cells use this. They use their hydrogen pumps to drive active transport of other nutrients they need to get into their cells. So you can see here the plant has the hydrogen ion, the proton pump working, and that is also powering this sucrose co-transporter moving sucrose into the cell. So the change of these concentration of the protons or the hydrogen ions is allowing this co-transporter protein to move sucrose, table sugar, inside the cell. And we'll stop there. The last section we have is bulk transport, but that is all for active transport.